What we're going to talk about in this episode is not just betrayal, it's an attempt at collusion. Donald Trump suggested to Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin that the US, China, and Russia should cooperate together against the International Criminal Court, which, for example, issued an arrest warrant for Putin for the abduction of Ukrainian children. Meanwhile, the exact opposite happened in Europe. And when you look at these two events, the picture is devastating for any hope that Vladimir Putin will ever be held accountable for this war. And if he never is held accountable, then Donald Trump will clearly help him with that, who, by the way, today has already extended the temporary lifting of sanctions against Russian oil for the third time. And here, his own words from back in March immediately come to mind when he mentioned that this is temporary. The lifting of sanctions against Russia will most likely become permanent because no one will even understand what actually happened. My name is Alexei Pecci. Let's discuss this topic together. But first I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel, give it a like, and write any comment you want. And before we begin, just a second of your attention because this episode is brought to you with the support of the Preply platform. This is a Ukrainian platform for online foreign language tutors. There are about 100,000 teachers and 90 languages there. It's perfect for those of you who, for example, are learning German, English, Polish, or really any language while living abroad. And what's very important for you is that right now they have a 50% discount on the first lesson. That's why there's a link in the description of this video, and by following it you'll immediately get a 50% discount through Alexei Pecci's YouTube channel. Well, let's move on to the episode. So first, I'll just give you two key events from the past week that are simply shocking, because everyone is paying attention to the summit. First between Trump and Xi Jinping, then Putin and Xi Jinping, then the war in the Middle East and so on. But something even more important for Ukraine has happened. On May 15, the Council of Europe voted to launch a special tribunal for the crime of aggression by Russia against Ukraine. 37 countries around the world have approved this historic decision. The head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Andriy Sybiha, calls this a point of no return and compares it to the Nuremberg Tribunal 80 years ago. The Netherlands have already agreed to host the first phase of the tribunal against Vladimir Putin and all the savage Russians in The Hague. The European Union has already allocated the first 10 million euros for the functioning of this tribunal. And then, just 3 days after this event, on May 18, the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, the US Secretary, publishes a post on the social network X and announces that Washington is extending the temporary sanctions exemption for Russian oil for the third time for another 30 days. Simply put, billions of dollars will now go into the Russian budget while the war is ongoing. If you didn't get it, yes, the United States of America is waging war against Iran so successfully that for the third time they're trying to save oil prices by lifting sanctions. Against Russia, spoiler, it doesn't help. But what happened between these two events is even more interesting and even more dangerous. Financial Times publishes a piece based on sources familiar with the negotiations in Beijing. Donald Trump suggested that Xi Jinping join forces with Putin against the International Criminal Court. According to Trump's idea, the three countries, the US, China, and Russia, should stand against international justice. At first glance, it's just three countries. These are different news stories, but it's all one story. And this is what it's called. While Europe is trying to hold Putin criminally accountable, Donald Trump is building a coalition with him against holding him accountable, and at the same time lifting the sanctions that were supposed to deprive him of money for the war. Let's go through everything step by step. So let's start with the tribunal. On May 15th in Chisinau, at a meeting of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, 37 countries from 3 continents made a key decision to launch it, a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. This tribunal intends to hold at least 20 Russian officials accountable, although their names have not yet been disclosed, but it is already clear that Vladimir Putin will be among them. The Netherlands have agreed to host the first phase of the tribunal's work in The Hague. This is such a wonderful historical parallel. What is fundamentally important to understand is that this tribunal is different from the International Criminal Court, which has already issued an arrest warrant for Putin. The difference lies in the elements of the crime. The fact is that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, in 2023 issued an arrest warrant for Putin for specific war crimes. This is the illegal deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children. This matters. But this is not the same as holding someone accountable for starting the war itself. For formal reasons, the International Criminal Court cannot currently prosecute Putin, nor can it hold other unwashed Russians accountable directly for the invasion of Ukraine itself. That's exactly why this special tribunal is being created. The point is that, unlike war crimes and crimes against humanity, where you can accuse even ordinary participants of any war and from both sides, crimes of aggression can only be attributed to the leadership of a country that made the decision to attack another country. So this is directly against Putin, Patrushev, Shoigu, and all the others, Lavrov, Peskov, Masha Zakharova, and everyone who participated in making the decision. In fact, this is personal responsibility for the decision to start the war. But this is where the main betrayal begins. Not from Russia, nothing else was expected from them, from Washington. The Financial Times writes that during the summit with Xi Jinping, Donald Trump proposed creating a coalition of the US, China, and Russia against the International Criminal Court. That is, against the court that was supposed to symbolize international justice for the aggression against Ukraine. Let me immediately point out why Trump hates the International Criminal Court, because that's a whole separate story. So, last year, Trump imposed financial and visa sanctions against the International Criminal Court itself because the court criticized and prosecuted citizens of the US and Israel. The White House said the court lacks jurisdiction over the United States and Israel because neither is a party to the Rome Statute. Well, since neither of the two countries is a party to the Rome Statute, that is, Trump imposed sanctions against the International Criminal Court because he was not satisfied with it. Well, and now he is suggesting that China and Russia join forces to destroy this court once and for all. Well, and now I'm sure the Israelis will say that supposedly the International Criminal Court also issued a warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu for crimes in Gaza, and that this warrant is supposedly illegal. And they say this warrant is clearly illegal, but how does it feel to be in a situation where your defenders against the International Criminal Court are Vladimir Putin and his officials, together with Trump and Xi Jinping? Think about that. And now the third part of this whole story, money. Because as you understand, without money, the whole story about the tribunal and justice turns into nothing more than beautiful rhetoric. On May 18, exactly 3 days after the decision about the tribunal in Europe, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced, and I quote, "The U.S. Treasury is issuing a temporary 30-day general license to give the most vulnerable nations the opportunity to temporarily access Russian oil that is currently at sea. This extension will provide additional flexibility, and we will work with these nations on issuing special licenses as needed. This general license will help stabilize the physical oil market and supply oil to the most energy-vulnerable countries. They're acting like real altruists, helping low-income states. Do you know who the main buyers of Russian oil are today? China, India, Asian countries. These are the countries Bessent lists. He calls it a license to support the most vulnerable nations, but the hypocrisy is clear. It sounds nice, but Scott Bessent omits that rising global oil prices for vulnerable nations are mainly due to Donald Trump's actions against Iran and his interference with Russian oil, now offset by the war in Ukraine. It's exactly because he can't handle the war in Iran that oil prices are so high around the world right now. And I emphasize this is already the third time in a row that Bessent has called it temporary. And this same Scott Bessent, back in March when he first issued these licenses, said, "Listen, no, this is just for a while, it's for 30 days and we absolutely won't extend it." And he also said that Russia won't benefit from the general license at all. To provide, you are the most vulnerable, I mean oil. Let me remind you, the first extension was on March 12, the second, was extended in April until May 16, and the third was just announced on May 18. This is a temporary extension of the sanctions waiver. But the Council on Foreign Relations says Treasury has already given Russia a temporary general license for vulnerable groups under the sanctions exemption. Lasts 1 day. Meanwhile, India, Indonesia, and other Asian countries that suffered losses in May support lifting sanctions on Russia. Exactly 3 days after the tribunal's decision, Finance Minister Scott Bessent states, quote, "The Treasury is issuing it to provide for the most vulnerable." He himself demanded that these same countries stop buying Russian oil, but then, I emphasize again, he simply messed up in the war with Iran. And looking ahead, we'll discuss this in more detail in the next episode. Today, Trump stated that supposedly he was already planning on May 19th to attend the financial tribunal of the Persian Scott Bessent, but he was talked out of it. It turned out that no one there actually understood what it was about. Quote, Trump is already saying, if anything, we attack on Friday. So on May 20, that's when we attack. So he had it planned for today. They issue a temporary general license to provide for the most vulnerable. Exactly 3 days later, we attack on Friday. And also, Trump stated that the unpopular war against Iran inside the US will soon become popular. He says, Americans are idiots. They just declare finances for the sake of what it's all for. The whole quote, the war and the Treasury says it should be popular. He says temporarily, to provide the most. Look, you will still thank me for the temporary oil, which... Share your opinion and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and don't forget, exactly in 3, the tribunal's decisions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with a donation. In Europe, Scott Bessent states, quote, the Treasury issues a daily license to provide the most vulnerable Russian oil. Is at sea.